Happy holidays, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the time with your family and friends, and thank you for joining me as I talk about my favorite Twilight Zone episodes. This episode is all about revenge, and guess what? It is a dish best served cold. These characters are all going to face their comeuppance in one way or another, so let's get to it. Number 3, the obsolete man. Librarian Romney Wordsworth, very fitting, and played by Burgess Meredith, one of my favorite actors in the Twilight Zone, is being brought before a tribunal. Books have been banned, and therefore the occupation of librarian, because they are deemed unnecessary and therefore obsolete. Similarly, the librarian's belief in God has further made him a pariah amongst society, for society has, quote-unquote, proven God to not exist. For these transgressions, the Chancellor has sentenced Wordsworth to die, but he's nice enough to give him the time, the manner of death, and the place. But it must be within 48 hours. Wordsworth thinks about it and says he wants an assassin to be the only one to know how he dies. He wants to die in his cell at midnight, but he asks for it to be televised. The Chancellor, thinking that these are some unusual requests, does grant them. Wordsworth invites the Chancellor into his cell, where he reveals that he will die by bomb explosion at midnight. The Chancellor approves of this, thinking it's a great way to go, until Wordsworth tells him that the cell has been locked.
Now, question. How does a man react to the knowledge that he's going to be blown to bits within a half an hour? Answer, that depends on the individual.
Wordsworth knows that if the state comes in to rescue the Chancellor, it would make him and the state look weak in the eyes of the people. Wordsworth then takes out a banned Bible and begins reading Psalms from it. Just a minute before midnight, the Chancellor cries out,
"Please, let me out in the name of God, let me out!"
Seemingly satisfied, Wordsworth gives him the key, and the Chancellor escapes just before the bomb explodes, killing the librarian. However, the Chancellor is now disgraced as a God-fearing man and coward, and his own subordinate becomes the new Chancellor. The old Chancellor is now the obsolete man, and he has been judged to be sentenced to death for his transgressions. He begs to be let go and tries to flee, only to be beaten to death by the attendants. Judge not, lest ye be judged yourself. A great example of how easy it is to pass judgment and to execute people when you're sitting up on high and separate from the people. But when that person has to face the same judgment, they crumble under pressure and don't display any of those tenets they claim to uphold. Also, this is a wonderful display of the justice dictators will face when they are no longer on high. Number 2, the masks. Jason Foster is sitting in his deathbed, waiting to die. It's apparent that he's both very ancient and very wealthy. His daughter, son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren come to see him on the eve of Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Each has a fatal flaw. Wilfred Sr. is all about money. Emily is a hypochondriac and seems to want everyone to feel sorry for her. Wilfred Jr. seems to be very dim-witted, and there are hints of a serial killer in there, like killing small animals for fun. And Paula, who can't stop looking at herself in the mirror. Mr. Foster talks of a great party that's going to take place inside his home, even though Emily and the others seem to want to go out to Mardi Gras and enjoy the fun. The family sits for dinner before Jason comes down and talks of these masks that were made by what he calls an old Cajun, and they seem to have certain properties. Foster, in a weird bit of fun, seems to want them to pick a mask that's based on the antithesis of their personality and how they perceive themselves. Foster asks them to each give a self-assessment, and then he hands them their masks. Now, truthfully, the masks don't seem to be particularly unique from one another. They all seem to be similarly hideous. Yet Foster has prepared a short speech for each of the masks and hands them to them, saying all of the qualities that he knows that they definitely are not, such as vain, money-grubbing, or a hypochondriac. He promises them that if they wear these masks until midnight, that every penny he owns and all of his estate will go to them. A few minutes before midnight, however, Emily starts to freak out, feeling that this is torture to have this mask on for this long. While berating them once again, Foster begins to cough.
Are you feeling weaker, Father?
At last, a note of hope in your voice, Emily.
Why must you always say such miserable, cruel things to me?
Foster, after making his final insults, passes away in his wheelchair, much to the delight of the other 4. They all begin to celebrate, and Wilfred Sr. removes his mask, only to be horrified at what he sees in the mirror.
What's the matter? What's the matter with you all?
Each has removed their mask, and yet the qualities of the mask remain. When the doctor removes Foster's mask, however, his face is unchanged, indicating that he was true to himself to the very end. The rest have to live forever with their new looks. You gotta love when people learn the hard way the error of their ways. This was a true comeuppance episode for not one, but 4 individuals who couldn't get out of their own way. Their personalities were as thin as the masks they wore. There's plenty of indication that this has been a lifelong issue in this family, and this was Foster's final way of teaching them a lifelong lesson. This way, it seems, was the only way that they would actually remember this for life. Number 1. Death's Head Revisited. Gunther Lutz checks into a hotel in Bavaria under the name Schmidt. For some reason, the receptionist seems to recognize him, but he redirects, saying that he was in the Panzer Division in World War II, and maybe that's how they know each other. He then asks if this nearby camp is a prison, to which the receptionist replies that it was a kind of prison, to which Lutz, or Schmidt, seems to be pressing the receptionist for more details. Mr. Lutz walks over and the camp comes into view. It turns out that it was Dachau. He walks the grounds for a while, seeming to revel in all of the torture and horrible things that he did to all the prisoners that were there. He then sees an old prisoner, Alfred Becker, who looks exactly the same as he had 17 years before.
You're the caretaker around here?
In a manner of speaking.
Becker questions Lutz about why he's come back after changing his name and fleeing to South America, to which Lutz replies he just wished that time was going to pass and heal all these wounds and all of his little mistakes. That's when Becker and the others put the SS captain on trial for all of his horrible misdeeds and transgressions. Among them, gassing, experimentation on women and children, and 14 deaths by his own hand. Lutz passes out from the terror and anxiety and wakes up, thinking that it was all a dream. Becker lets him know that he didn't just imagine this, and that it was real. And as he's about to pass sentencing, that's when Lutz remembers that 17 years before, he had killed Becker and set the camp on fire in an attempt to cover up all of the terrible things that had happened there. Lutz's punishment is to see and feel all of the horror that he's inflicted on all of those poor people for those years.
Captain Lutz, if you can still reason, if there's still any portion of your mind that can still function, take this thought with you. This is not hatred. This is retribution. This is not revenge. This is justice.
He winds up in a mental hospital, and the doctor is so confused considering just 2 hours before, he seemed perfectly fine. The doctor also wonders why Dachau is still standing and why we keep it standing. Revenge is perfectly bittersweet here, as all of the original death and torture was so unnecessary to begin with. I wish that this was something that really could happen to all of those horrible people that did this to those prisoners. Unfortunately for the dead, they'll never be able to inflict the same pain and torture that those Nazi soldiers inflicted on them. But one can only hope that those soldiers got what they deserved. I'll leave you now with Rod Serling's outro to that episode, because every time I hear it, it gets the hair on my arm standing up.
And the moment we forget this, the moment we cease to be haunted by its remembrance, then we become the gravediggers. Something to dwell on and to remember. Not only in the Twilight Zone, but wherever men walk God's earth.